Welcome to the Secret Doctrine webinar. Today we are going to see the central shloka about how humanity developed or awakened the mind. And this involved the collaboration of certain celestial beings. Some of them are or belong to what we call our own order of celestial beings. Those are what we call in theosophy our higher ego, which is actually what we really are. We are, as we said, this order of celestial beings. And then some others are from the fifth order, which came to help in the process. So let us proceed with the second volume. First, we will explore briefly the second root race. In our last class, we saw the development of the first one, and then we will go on to the third root race, that is when the incarnation of these angels happen. So the shloka says the breath, and Blavatsky adds the human monad, needed a form. The fathers gave it. The breath needed a gross body. The earth molded it. The breath needed the spirit of life. The solar laws, or spirits, breathed it into its form. The breath needed a mirror of its body, and Blavatsky adds the astral shadow. We gave it our own, said the Dhyanis. The breath needed a vehicle of desires, Kamarupa. It has it, said the drainer of the waters. And Blavatsky adds Suchi, the fire of passion and animal instinct. So you see here there is a listing of some of the elements that the monad needs in order to express itself in a personal way on the lower planes, and how there are different forces and celestial beings, entities that participate in preparing this vessel for the monad. Now the shloka continues, the breath needs a mind to embrace the universe. We cannot give that, said the fathers, the Pitris. I never had it, said the spirit of the earth. The form would be consumed were I to give it mine, said the great solar fire. Nascent men remained an empty, senseless Buddha. Thus have the boneless given life to those who became later men with bones in the third race. So here, this is like a recap of the situation of humanity at this point, in which there was the monad, there was a vessel for the monad, the body and the double of the body, and the passions, the emotional principle, let's say. But the human being was incomplete because it didn't have a mind. And we will see how that happened. So the second race, which is still mindless, the shloka says, was the product by budding and expansion, the asexual form from the sexless shadow. Thus was all anew the second race produced. So the shlokas go now a little into how these races of human beings, and when we say human beings, remember this is just an embryonic form of a human being. Real humanity, as we can regard it today, started after by the end of the third root race, after humanity got the mind, the sexes separated, and then the human form began to evolve until it was more or less what it is today. So this second race, it is said that reproduced itself by budding and expansion. So Blavatsky explains, the astral form clothing the monad of the first root race was surrounded, as it still is, by its egg-shaped sphere of aura. So remember that these races didn't have a physical body yet, So they were basically like an aura, which is spheroidal. When the season of reproduction arrives, the sub-astral, meaning a part of this astral aura, extrudes a miniature of itself from the egg of surrounding aura. This germ grows and feeds on the aura till it becomes fully developed, when it gradually separates from its parent, carrying with it its own sphere of aura, just as we see living cells reproducing their like. So the picture there is from a microscope, and it's the reproduction of yeast. The yeast reproduces itself by budding, just like Blavatsky describes that the second race did. So we can see in nature that there are still some organisms that have this form of reproduction. Of course, the yeast also has a sexual cycle. It can alternate between the two. So basically, new bodies or new vehicles of consciousness for the monads would be produced in this way. And then that little sphere would expand and become the size that were all of them at the moment. The shloka says, then the second root race evolved the sweat-born, the third race. The sweat grew, its drops grew, and the drops became hard and round, the egg of the future race, the man swan, Hamsa, which is a Sanskrit word, of the later third. First male-female, then man and woman. So now it goes into the transition between the second and the third root race. And the commentary says, first come the self-existent on this earth. They are the spiritual lives projected by the absolute will and law at the dawn of every rebirth of the worlds. These lives are the divine Shista, the seed Manus or the Prajapati, and the Pitris. So these self-existent are the Pitris, which are the seed for the new humanity. So at the beginning of the activity in a new world, the first entities that appear in relation to the development of humanity are these Pitris. And they are said to be self-existent because they are not the product of this plane. From this proceed the first race, the self-born, which are the astral shadows of their progenitors. So we saw that in our last class. From the Pitris are emanated the vehicles for the first root race, which are called the self-born. And then from the first race emanated the second, called the sweat-born and the boneless. This is the second root race endowed by the preservers, Rakshasas. These are a kind of celestial beings too, and the incarnating gods, Asuras and the Kumaras, with the first primitive and weak spark, the germ of intelligence. So first, we see here that the second root race is called the sweat-born. We just saw that the second root race develops by budding, and then the third root race develops by sweat, and we will see what that means. But there is a transition. The earlier part of the second root race develops by this form of budding, but as that root race goes through the different sub-races and becomes more and more dense or closer to the physical, then that budding begins to look different, and the later part of the second root race and the earlier part of the third root race they develop by what is called by sweat, and we will see, as I said, what that means. Now you see here that the Asuras and the Kumaras, which they are references to the fifth and the fourth orders of beings, the ones that are involved in providing the forms with the mind, it says that they give this this later second root race, the first primitive and weak spark, the germ of intelligence. So you can see here that already in the second root race, we have the beginning of the awakening of the mind. But this is not enough to make the forms intelligent beings. We are still, as I said, at the level of the embryonic stages. And from this, in turn, proceeds the third root race, the twofold, the androgynes or hermaphrodites, and the bisexual race. The first races hereof are shells, till the last is inhabited, that is informed, by the dhyanis, or the celestial beings, by the souls. So let's see a little of this. Blavatsky explains the third race is separated into three distinct divisions, consisting of men differently procreated. The early sub-races of the third humanity procreated their species by a kind of exudation of moisture or vital fluid, the drops of which coalescing formed an oviform ball, or shall we say egg, but the mode of procreation by later races changed. So there was a kind of exudation, as Blavatsky says, of drops of vitality which separating themselves from the aura of the third root race became more or less solid, like an egg, and then that began to develop into that early human being. So these are the races that are called sweat-born. And then she says the little ones of the earlier races were entirely sexless, shapeless even for all one knows, but those of the later races were born androgynous. So we saw in the previous class this progression from sexless to having both sexes in one and then separating in two sexes. And Blavatsky says it is in the third race that the separation of sexes occurred. From being previously asexual, humanity became distinctly hermaphrodite or bisexual, and finally the man-bearing eggs began to give birth gradually and almost imperceptibly in their evolutionary development, first to beings in which one sex predominated over the other, and finally to distinct men and women. So you see that according to this separation of sexes was something that happened gradually over, Blavatsky says in some other quote, over millions of years. But the potentiality for both sexes or genders are still in the DNA of human beings. And the fact that is possible can be seen in some babies that they are born with both genders. Of course, at this point in evolution, that is an anomaly, but that was the rule in earlier stages of evolution. And according to Blavatsky, that will become again the rule in later stages of evolutions. Several millions of years from now, when the physical shape of human beings will have changed quite a bit from what we are right now. These are different cycles of evolution. So here is a summary of the modes of reproduction. The Barhishat Pitris are the self-existent that the commentary mentioned. Then we have the first root race that are said to be self-born. Then we have the early second root race that reproduced by means of this kind of budding. Then the late second root race and the early third root race are the sweat-born. Then that sphere of sweat became more solid, and humanity began to be born out of eggs, like the middle third root race. And here again, we are approaching the physical, but not quite physical as we know it. And finally, the late third root race, after the separation of the sexes, humanity begins to be born from the womb as it is now. Now, it is interesting to see that these modes of reproduction that seem to be so strange, there are brief references in other scriptures. Actually, in some scriptures of Buddhism, although they don't really explain what this means and therefore is sometimes interpreted in very different ways, some scriptures do mention these same kind of modes of reproduction. They talk about humans being born from eggs, from sweat, the self-born humans, and then of course our normal mode of reproduction. And this can be seen, there are traces of this also in Hinduism and in Jainism, although sometimes they interpret that these modes of reproduction refer to not only to humans but to other animals, animals, insects. Now, in none of the known scriptures from these traditions describe these modes of reproduction to the degree of detail that the stanzas of Xian do. So that is something that is quite unique to the stanzas of Xian. So now we come to the key point in the production of a human being. This is in the stanza 7 in the second volume, from the semi-divine to the first human races, because the first and the second and the early third root race are said to be divine in the sense that they were not quite physical, human, they were not entangled in emotions or in a concrete mind, so they were still regarded as semi-divine. Now Blavatsky says that this stanza contains in itself the whole key to the mysteries of evil, the so-called fall of the angels, and the many problems that that have puzzled the brains of the philosophers from the time that memory of man began. It solves the secret of the subsequent inequalities of intellectual capacity and gives a logical explanation to the incomprehensible karmic course throughout the eons which followed. So this addresses the question of human differences. When Blavatsky wrote this, you had basically only two options in regards to human beings. Either the option, at least in the West, either the option that God created all souls equal, or that human beings developed by evolution coming from the apes and developing intelligence. Now, if you think that God developed all souls equally, how come that there are some geniuses in humanity, in different fields, say in science, typically we would say Einstein, or some religious geniuses, like many religious teachers, saints, prophets, keeping within the Western tradition. And at the same time, we have human beings with very limited intellectual capacities or very limited emotional capacities. Some human beings that have a very, very simple life in nature, in the tribes, which is neither better nor worse, but intellectually, except for the great civilizations that, as we are going to see, come from earlier civilizations of human development, but there are some tribes of natives that have a very simple life with a very simple intellectual development. Of course, many of them are far closer to living in harmony with nature than we are, because their minds are not so developed to break them apart from nature, and there is a lot of wisdom we can get from them. But generally speaking, how come that there are differences in human beings? Even in the developed countries, we see that there are people who seem not to be able to live abiding by moral rules. How is this possible if God created all souls equal? Where is the justice? What's the justification for all of this? So Blavatsky says that the shloka gives an answer to all of this. So let's start seeing what this says. The sons of wisdom, the sons of night, issued from the body of Brahma when it became night, Blavatsky says, ready for rebirth, came down. They saw the intellectually vile forms of the third root race, still senseless race, Blavatsky says. We can choose, said the lords. We have wisdom. Some entered the chayas, the bodies that were there. Some projected a spark. Some deferred till the fourth race. From their own essence, they filled, intensified the kama. Kama is the vehicle of desire and the more passional nature of human beings. Those who received but a spark remained destitute of higher knowledge. The spark burned low. The third remained mindless. The jivas, monads, were not ready. These were set apart among the 7 primitive human species. They became the narrow-headed. The third were ready. In this shall we dwell, said the lords of the flame and of the dark wisdom. So you see that here in a single shloka there are many cases that are together. Cases in which the dhyan is incarnated, in others they projected a spark, in others they didn't incarnate. Part of the third root race was ready, part of the third root race was not ready. So this is a shloka that has a lot of information, that is covering a lot of ground. Blavatsky even says that she cannot explain the whole shloka with all the different possibilities that are involved there, not only because of space, but also she says, I'm not sure that I know all the possibilities that are there. So in her comments, she makes some comments on the main features of the different circumstances with different groups of humanity, which is good enough for us to have a general idea of what was going on at the time. But we have to keep in mind the complexity of this. If we think again, well, it is easy, God created all souls equal, they all incarnate, God creates a body for each soul and they incarnate there, then that is quite simple. But the picture that the esoteric philosophy proposes is far, far more complex. And as we normally see, even in biology, evolution is very complex. So it's not surprising that the evolution on the spiritual planes also would be as complex as that, or even more. So let's go case by case as far as we can. First, the sons of wisdom, the sons of night, ready for rebirth, came down. And Blavatsky says they are egos. This is the, remember I explained the word ego in Greek means I-ness. So in theosophy, many times to that essence of I-ness that incarnates in human beings, in theosophy is called the higher ego, or the ego with a capital E. That essence of I-ness comes from what we can call the soul. So these egos are the souls of humanity, which, as we said, are celestial entities. So they are egos or manas, since they are called Manasaputra. Manasaputra, all these celestial beings that are involved with the evolution of the mind, or the production of a mind into the forms, are called Manasaputra. Putra means child, and Manasa comes from Manas, mind. So she says they are called Manasaputra, born of Mahat or Brahma. Mahat also is Mahat is the universal mind. So all these celestial beings are sons of the universal mind. So these egos had to pass through earthly human experiences to become all-wise and be able to start on the returning ascending cycle. So they are already celestial beings, but as we explained in our last class, to become all-wise, to become able to retain an awareness of their true nature on all planes of the universe, they need to incarnate. They need to have the experience of being surrounded by physical matter, that is by lower mental, by astral, and by physical matter, and retain their wisdom even in those conditions. So that is part of what Blavatsky says means by becoming all-wise. So these celestial beings were called to incarnate in forms. Now Blavatsky says it is only in the actual midway round, this is in the fourth round, the fourth evolutionary round out of 7, which is the round in which we are right now. So it is only in the actual midway round that man develops in himself entirely the fourth principle as a fifth vehicle for the fifth. So the fourth principle is this passional nature, kama, and kama needs to be in a certain degree of maturity to be the vehicle of what in theosophy we call the lower mind. If this fourth principle is not mature to serve as a link between mind and body, then human beings would not be able to be self-aware. So it is only, so the question is, why now? Why is it that in the fourth round, in the middle point of the fourth round, the celestial beings begin to incarnate, and not before or not after the fourth round? And Blavatsky answers that it is only after there is half of the cycle of evolution has gone through in the fourth round that the fourth principle is mature enough to receive the incarnation of human beings or the human souls. So she says, having passed through all the kingdoms of nature in the previous 3 rounds, the physical frame was ready to receive the divine pilgrim, the monad, at the first dawn of human life. And this happens at the midpoint of the third root race, that is, 18 million years ago, man was endowed with manas. So she says that this incarnation of the celestial beings, which brought the mind to the human forms, happened 18 million years ago. Now, at this point, humanity was barely physical 18 million years ago. And then, as we are going to see very briefly, this very early humanity developed into a civilization that Blavatsky called Lemuria. Now, the continent of Lemuria, according to the esoteric philosophy, is right now at the bottom of the ocean. So all the remains that we have in the continents that are available, they belong more to our own root race, that is the fifth root race. The remains that are millions of years old, they are not available to us at the moment because they are under the ocean. But according to Blavatsky, this point of incarnation came around 18 million years ago. So what we have here is that we have the spirit, the monad, and we have the physical body. So that was the case for the first and second root race. By physical body, I'm including the dense aspect, and then the double, and then the prana, which is the third principle that vitalizes the physical body. And then at this point also, we have a passional nature, the fourth principle, that is mature enough to receive the mind. So now the soul, which is the source of what we call the mind, the fifth principle, can incarnate in this lower nature that are the 4 lower principles. So this is the point at which we are right now in the shloka. Now, when they came down, all these celestial beings, and they came down means from their state of their dwelling on the spiritual planes, they allegorically look down to the physical plane and look at the bodies, and they saw the intellectually vile forms of the first third root race, which was still senseless. And then they said, we can choose, said the Lords, we have wisdom. So the first part of the third root race was quite undeveloped, but nature had done everything that it could to develop the best that it could, the best form that nature could for a human being. And now what was needed is to have the guidance of the soul to perfect the forms. So the forms were quite unsatisfactory, especially for entities that were spiritual entities on the spiritual planes. On the spiritual planes, they are beyond physical needs, hunger or thirst. They are beyond pain or sickness. They are beyond birth and death. So these celestial beings now had to come and incarnate and submit themselves to all these limitations in bodies that were still quite primitive and that could very poorly respond to their commands. So they said, we can choose, we have wisdom. And then Blavatsky says, when the sons of wisdom came to incarnate the first time, some of them incarnated fully, others projected into the forms only a spark, while some of the shadows were left over from being filled and perfected till the fourth race. Those races remained destitute of knowledge. So this is just the general survey of the main possibilities that were there. Now let's see first those who incarnated. They said the third were ready. The people in the third root race were, or the forms were ready. In this shall we dwell, said the lords of the flame and of the dark wisdom. So some enter the chayas. These are the ones that enter. And Blavatsky explains, a portion of the mankind of the third race, all those monads of men who had reached the highest point of merit and karma in the preceding Manvantara, owed their psychic and rational natures to divine beings hypostasizing into their fifth principles. This is from hypostasis, is the incarnation of a divine principle, let's say. So there is a group of monads that were already quite evolved. She says those who had reached the highest point of merit in a previous evolution. So they were quite evolved, but they still needed to finish the human experience. They had not been able to finish the human experience in a previous evolutionary cycle. So in this evolutionary cycle, they are almost done with this, and they incarnated into forms, and they incarnated into the best forms that had been produced. Because remember that there are 7 classes of human beings that were produced by these 7 classes of Petris. Now each one of these classes of Petris, they themselves have different degrees of evolution. Those Petris that were more evolved, they were able to generate better forms than the Petris that were less evolved. So in humanity there were different forms available, even in the third root race. Some of them were more suitable for the expression of the spiritual, and some of them were less. Naturally, the monads that were more suitable, or the monads that were more evolved, incarnated in the bodies that were more suitable. So each monad, each group of monad incarnated in bodies that were more or less in tune with their evolution. Now she says that these sons of wisdom, she explains a little what I just said, or the spiritual dhyanis, had become intellectual, had acquired already or awakened the mind through their contact with matter, because they had already reached during previous cycles of incarnation, that degree of intellect which enabled them to become independent and self-conscious entities on this plane of matter. So these celestial beings had already acquired, as I said, the ability to be self-conscious entities on the physical plane. Many of the monads that are going to incarnate at this point in the third root race, they have not acquired that. The first races of humanity were hardly self-conscious. But now we are all self-conscious after having gone through 2.5 more cycles of evolution. So these dhyanis that incarnated completely or entered the bodies, they had already in previous cycles of evolution attained the ability to retain self-consciousness even on the physical plane. And Blavatsky says they were reborn in this particular cycle only by reason of karmic effects. They entered those who were ready, the best part of the third root race, and eventually became the arhats or sages alluded to above. So this portion of the third root race that was ready to receive the full incarnation of a celestial being, of the soul, let's say, after a few incarnations, they became masters of wisdom. They became arhats, as the stanza says there. And they became the sages, part of the sages that guided the other monads who were experiencing humanity for the first time. Now, other divine or celestial beings only projected a spark. From their own essence, they filled, intensified the kama, the vehicle of desire. So you see that when the soul projects a spark into the body, kama is sometimes called in the theosophical literature the animal soul. Animal soul because this fourth principle, kama, develops during the fourth kingdom of nature, which is the animal kingdom, if we count from the elementals as a kingdom. So during the animal evolution, the fourth principle is developed. That's why this is the animal soul or the principle that we inherit from the animals. Now, in animals, things like aggression or sexual desire or the search for pleasure and the running away from pain, all these things manifest in a perfect way, in a balanced way, respecting the appropriate seasons, only when there is the need at the moment for aggression or for running away from the aggression. So in animals, the animal soul is still in harmony with nature. Now, when a human soul incarnates in these forms, which they had the fourth principle, this animal soul, they are waiting for the soul, that intensifies the passional nature. So now in human beings, that which was perfectly fine in animals, like this tendency to be aggressive when there is the need for that, now in human beings, because we have a mind and memory and we can plan, aggression stops being the natural response to a situation, but now it becomes something like the desire for domination and the thirst for revenge. And you see the intellectual elements at the beginning of evolution amplify or intensify the kamic nature. So now in humanity, the animal nature is overexpressed, expressed in ways that is not healthy, and that is a problem with our current humanity. Now Blavatsky says those who received but a spark remain destitute of higher knowledge. The spark burned low. And she says those who were half ready, those who were ready, the divine or celestial beings incarnated fully in them and then they became, in a few generations, the arhats. But those forms that were of less quality, that were half ready, but were appropriate for the degree of evolution of these kind of monads. So those who were half ready, who received but a spark, constitute the average humanity, which has to acquire its intellectuality during the present evolutionary cycle, during the present Manvantaric evolution, after which they will be ready in the next for the full reception of the sons of wisdom. So in the average humanity, the soul cannot fully express through the form. The soul is like, is still throwing a spark, is still trying to influence the personality, but we cannot say that it's fully incarnated because the soul doesn't have full self-mastery over the personality. So the monads of the average humanity are learning to do that right now. And once they learn to do this, and once the personal nature is purified and transcended, then the soul is said to be able to incarnate fully, and then that person becomes a sage or an arhat. So that is the idea here. Now the other situation, the third remained mindless. A third group within the third root race remained mindless. The Arjivas, or monads, were not ready. These were set apart among the 7 primitive human species. They became the narrow-headed. And Blavatsky explains they were not ready signifies that the karmic development of these monads had not yet fitted them to occupy the forms of men destined for incarnation in higher intellectual races. Those which were not ready at all, the latest monads, which had hardly evolved from their last transitional and lower animal forms at the close of the third round, remained the narrow-brained of the stanza. So you see there are some monads that had hardly finished their experience in the animal kingdom. So when the time to incarnate as humans came, we have a group of monads that come from previous evolutions, that they were almost finished with the human experience. Then we have a group of monads that had been human monads since the beginning of this planetary chain, or since the early stages of this planetary chain, like in the first round, the second, the third, and now we are in the fourth round. So these monads are the average humanity. And then there was a group of monads that during the first, second, and third rounds, they were still animating animals, and they had just made it to evolve so that they can now experience the human kingdom. But they are very close still to the animal kingdom of evolution. So these monads that were not quite ready to incarnate and provide the forms with a fully awakened mind, just because they were not still grown enough. When we talk about evolution, we are just talking about growth through time. It's like a child cannot drive a car just because it still has to develop certain skills. A teenager can drive a car and it will drive it less efficiently than a fully developed adult that already learned how to drive a car. So you probably won't give a teenager a car that it could be too dangerous for him to drive. But it would be safe to give a better car to an adult, for example. So this allegory may help us understand that this choosing of different bodies according to the evolution of the monads is just the natural result of the development of skill. It has nothing to do with any kind of discrimination. It's just natural. So these monads were not even able to project a spark, and those bodies remained destitute of knowledge. They remained quite close to the animal kingdom. They were similar to the idea that we have today of some cavemen, which we say were not quite Homo sapiens, but they were close enough to be Homo sapiens. Now, at this point, we are even before this. We will explore later what these hominids, where they come from. But the idea is that these monads incarnated in forms that were still too close to animals, and they remain destitute of knowledge. Blavatsky says they are simply the latest arrivals among the human monads, which were not ready, which have to evolve during the present round, during the fourth round, as on the three remaining globes. Remember the planetary chain, there are 7 globes. We are on the 4th globe, there are 3 more globes. And when evolution goes through those 3 globes, the 4th round of evolution will be finished. So Blavatsky says they have to evolve during the 3 remaining globes, hence on 4 different planes of being. Remember that these globes are not on the physical plane, so as to arrive at the level of the average class when they reach the 5th round. So they will arrive at the level of the average humanity in the next round. The Sons of Wisdom had spurned the early third race, that is the non-developed, and are shown to incarnate in and thereby endow with intellect the later third race. So in this case, they waited until the bodies developed a little more and the monads themselves developed a little more and incarnated later in the last part of the third root race. All these monads that were not ready at the moment. And then the last situation, some celestial beings deferred the incarnation till the 4th root race. Now, in this case, these celestial beings that deferred to incarnate until the 4th root race was not because they were not developed enough, the monads there were not developed enough. These were celestial beings that had acquired in a previous evolution a certain degree of intelligence, but not enough to be wise and know that they should incarnate, but they have developed more intelligence than other monads which really didn't have any choice. So they are like in between. They have enough intelligence to choose, but not enough to choose rightly. And this is, I guess, similar to what would happen to most of humanity at this point in evolution. If the souls were, the souls as they are at this point in evolution, were given the chance to incarnate in very primitive bodies, probably most souls would try to avoid that. So this group of celestial beings said, we will wait until the bodies get more developed. The bodies are not ready, they are ugly, we don't want to leave the spiritual planes yet. Now Blavatsky says, those on the other hand, who jealous of their intellectual freedom on the spiritual plane, unfettered as it then was by the bonds of matter, said, we can choose, we have wisdom, and incarnated far later into the 4th root race. These had their first karmic punishment prepared for them. So we saw this in previous classes, how this was a mistake out of pride, and that produced a negative karmic cause. Blavatsky says that these Sons of Wisdom who had deferred till their incarnation till the 4th race, which was already tainted physiologically with sin and impurity, they produced a terrible cause, the karmic result of which weighs on them to this day. It was produced in themselves, and they became the carriers of that seed of iniquity for eons to come, because the bodies they had to inform had become defiled through their own procrastination. We will see this in the next class, but those bodies who were actually quite ready for them to incarnate, they left the bodies alone without a mind, and those bodies degenerated, so that then when they incarnated later on, the bodies were already defiled. It was far more difficult to influence these bodies, and these bodies became, or these personalities became, quite selfish and rebellious, and they had a difficulty handling these personalities. So that was the result of their procrastination, as Blavatsky says, and we will explore a little what happened with these souls. So as we can see, there are souls with different degrees of evolution, and they incarnated at different times. They incarnated in different bodies that were more or less receptive to the influence of the soul. And Blavatsky says in the great book of the mysteries, we are told that 7 lords created 7 men. 3 lords, the Anchohans or Pitris, were holy and good. 4 less heavenly and full of passion. The Chayas, or these forms, the phantoms of the fathers, were as they. So remember, when in the first race the Pitris emanated these forms, those forms were evolved or as good as the Pitris themselves were. Remember at this point that in the esoteric philosophy, angels are not perfect. We still have unconsciously the Judeo-Christian traditions, especially those who were born in this religious tradition, the idea that God creates perfect angels, full-blown, perfect angels, and creates perfect human forms. But that is not the case, at least from the esoteric philosophy point of view. The angels themselves are evolving. The angels themselves have different degrees of skills, and they all do the best they can, but they cannot do more than they can. Now, this is not unfair, because everything in nature is on different degrees of evolution. So there are some monads for which the more imperfect bodies that the lower Pitris can produce are a match. And then those monads that are more evolved, they get a better body that is produced by higher Pitris. So this is what Blavatsky is saying here. And then she says, this accounts for the differences in human nature, which is divided into 7 gradations of good and evil. So from an esoteric point of view, it seems that there are 7 stages in the development of human morality. I suppose from the stage of those human beings that they just kill others, they have no concern for others, they are just very selfish and self-centered, to the degree of those human beings that are close to be enlightened beings, that are full of love or compassion. So within this range, there are, according to Blavatsky, these 7 degrees of humanity. And this is what accounts for the differences. Why is this difference, as we said? It's because the monads that are incarnated have a different evolutionary stage, and also the bodies that were given to the monads originally, and from which in each incarnation the monad continues with that kind of body. The bodies themselves, as I said, were of a better or lower quality. By better or lower quality, I mean they were more receptive or less receptive to the spiritual nature. Now, To understand this, we have to remember that at the level of the soul, the souls are always far more evolved than anything the personality can show. When we see personalities, people here on the physical plane doing terrible things, that is never the soul, the one that is doing these terrible things. In the esoteric tradition, there is a duality on the manifested aspect of a human being between the soul and the personality. The soul can affect the personality only to a certain degree, but the personality has its own life, its own consciousness. Of course, ultimately speaking, this consciousness of the personality is derived from the soul. The ray of mind that we call the lower mind is an emanation from the soul. It's that spark that they projected into the human forms. Now, when that spark is weak and the matter in which the spark is trying to work is very strong and has its own tendencies, then the soul can do very little to guide the personality. So every time we see a person that does something terrible, the first victim of that is the soul, more than the people who are suffering for the actions of this person. Because that means that soul doesn't have enough skill, or it may not even be awake enough to realize what the personality is doing. And therefore, the soul is chained to future incarnations that will be difficult, that will be incarnations in the midst of suffering. On the other hand, people who are receiving the bad actions of somebody, for example, they are burning past karma, and that suffering is freeing the soul from future suffering in future incarnations. And the idea is that with each new incarnation, as the soul grows and develops ability, the soul can generate better and better personalities that are more and more receptive to the nature of the soul. So this is what Blavatsky explains. There were seven tabernacles ready to be inhabited by monads under seven different karmic conditions. According to the karmic conditions that these groups of monads brought, they incarnated in the fit vessels that they needed. The commentaries explain on this basis the easy spread of evil as soon as the human forms had become real men. Because as we are going to see very briefly, in this series we are not going to go into the later evolution of human civilizations. The subject for this series is the birth of humanity. So we will stop with the third root race. But as soon as the mind began to be more awakened in the forms, then the forms of those monads that were little evolved and that the bodies were less receptive to the spiritual influence, they soon fell into evil ways, into conquering and power and all this. At the same time, there were other souls who incarnated and became adepts, and they were trying to teach the average humanity better ways. But this is why what we call evil was there present from the very beginning in humanity, not because there was a single action like eating the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, not because there was a single action that introduced sin in humanity, but because it is the inescapable consequence of a still deficient state of evolution, no? or still a state in which there is not enough wisdom. And this is unavoidable. Evolution is about gaining more wisdom. So before we gain all the wisdom, we will act foolishly. But by acting foolishly, is that we develop more wisdom. By acting foolishly and receiving the consequences of that, we will develop more wisdom. So from the esoteric point of view, evil is part of evolution. It's not something we want to promote, but we always want to promote good, but we go into good through the experience of mistaken actions that we call evil.